What if a single object could carry the weight of generations, the anger of battlefield mud, the whisper of prayers that never found their end, the cold calculus of a trigger pulled in panic? What if that object did not only remember, but reached back into the present with consequences that cannot be explained by logic or law? On the morning of September 17, 1862, fields near a small Maryland town filled with smoke and men, with the world narrowing for many to the flashing edge of a bayonet or the thunder of a musket volley. That clash, soaked in blood and stamped into memory, would be called Antietam, or Sharpsburg, the single deadliest day in American military history, a day that left nearly 23,000 men killed, wounded, or missing and transformed the land itself into a place of weight and silence. Centuries later, the battlefield is a place people visit to remember and to reckon. Guides point to the sunken road called the Bloody Lane, to the charred place of Miller's cornfield, and to the stone church that seemed to hold the sky itself. Yet woven into the official maps and memorials is a quieter, more crooked thread, a rumor passed between reenactors, between families who've kept trunks of relics, between a town's oldest resident and the curious who ask too many questions. The rumor is about a rifle, an ordinary enough firearm by outward account, but one said to be touched by the same violences that made the field infamous. Those who have handled it tell of misluck, of whispers that seem to come from its stock, of a cadence of small tragedies following its path like a shadow. Is the rifle a superstition given exaggeration by nostalgia and grief? Or is it something else, an artifact that holds an imprint of events so intense they have left a trace on matter itself? Tonight we begin to trace that story, a mixture of history, testimony, science, and something we cannot name. We will walk the old dirt roads, read the record books, listen to those who swear they have seen and felt the strange. We will not promise answers. We will only promise to look, to question, and to linger where the light falters. What follows is a story of place and object, of how grief and technology and faith can tangle into a single legend. The question that will guide us is simple and dangerous. Can a human-made thing become a vessel for the past, alive enough to change the present? Dawn first finds Antietam in a breath of dampness. Low clouds hang over the ridge lines, threading the trees in a shawl of silver. If you arrive in the hour before tourists, the air tastes faintly of iron and wild grass. The soil, dark and loamy, still remembers the blood it has taken. The landscape is not wild in an untrammeled way. Rows of graves and trimmed grass insist otherwise, but there are corners and hollows where the battle's geometry dissolves into the soft, indifferent shapes of nature. Here, a fence post leans as if conceding the argument to wind. There, a stone wall is patched with 1,000 small repairs, each one a tiny attempt to control what cannot be contained. Walk toward the sunken lane and time clamps down. The road dips and narrows, the world falling away so that the sky seems both wider and smaller. In the lane's cut, the earth holds moisture longer. It holds, too, an aura of compressed sound. Even on a bright summer afternoon, the lane can feel like a throat, an enclosed, breath-held place where echoes come back a hair late. The cornfields that surround it now are green and ordered in peace, but the rows are owed a debt. In 1862 they were torn into irregular, brutal clumps by artillery and bodies. Near the Dunker Church the ground rises, the wooden steeple, rebuilt and humble, casting a narrow shadow. It is a landmark that witnesses often point to when describing confusion, regiments that crossed and recrossed the same stretch of land, men disoriented by smoke and the blare of battle who mistook friend for foe. The bridge over Antietam Creek, Burnside's Bridge, a narrow stone span framed by moss and poplars, still drops into a deep, slow river. Men who crossed it did so under aim and heat. The stones at its end wear the polish of 1,000 footsteps, many of them hurried, many of them broken. Here, where the present is laid clean for daylight visitors and the past remains stitched into the soil, we imagine the rifle first appearing. Picture a soldier, perhaps a young man from Pennsylvania, or a Virginian whose letters speak of mothers and plowed fields, slumping, weapon lodged across his lap in a way that makes the thing look almost human. Imagine the careful hands of another soldier taking the rifle, or a medic collecting it from a heap of uniforms. Imagine it stored in a trunk in a farmhouse, later held by a veteran who refuses to speak of it, later passed down, traded, lost, and found. Imagine that each time a new person takes hold of the wooden stock or bracelets the cold steel, a small ripple passes through their days. A night of fever, a failed harvest, a child's unexplained illness. The details of these ripples vary with the teller, the pattern does not. Antietam's weather itself seems to do the work of the story. Fog and rain have a way of re-entraining visitors into another century. On wet days, the field is a sheet of gray, the headstones' white faces gleam like bones. On blistering late summer afternoons, the heat can seem to pull memory from the ground, an almost palpable shimmer where the air appears to tremble. The seasons complicate the tale the way a mirror complicates a face. Autumn brings the smell of wood smoke from houses in town and a melancholy that tightens the mouth of anyone thinking of loss. Winter brackets the place in hush and gives the earth a new, quiet dignity. Even the sounds matter, the sudden call of a hawk above the corn, the whisper of tall grass, the hollow clunk of a distant tractor. In these small details, the field resists being flattened into a single story. It is layered, stubborn, particular. The rifle story requires this type of place, not just ground where a fight occurred, but ground that carries an insistence in its weather, its shapes, and even in the way the light falls. It asks us to understand how human memory and landscape can reinforce one another, how the remembered sound of a volley can make loose stones rattle like pepper when a modern car passes, how a child's sudden cry on a picnic afternoon can feel like proof to a listener already prepared to believe. In short, this scene is both shrine and instrument. The land remembers in 1,000 small ways. The rifle, if the stories are to be believed, remembers too. As you picture this place, hold in mind the ordinary things: a tin mug left by a veteran's grave, a faded photograph in a wallet, the frayed edge of a handkerchief. The extraordinary in our tale will be braided into these ordinary objects. It will be in the tiny, human traces that time refuses to erase. Now, after seeing the field and feeling the small human artifacts that populate it, turn your attention to the heart of this story, the object itself and the questions it raises. The legend is deceptively simple. Somewhere among the trunks and attics connected to Antietam, among relic dealers, private collections, even a museum storage room, there exists a rifle. It is described differently by different people: an Enfield, a Springfield, a smoothbore that has been altered over years. Its stock has a faint, dark scar the size of a palm, a line of nicked metal along the barrel, perhaps initials scratched into the butt. To the rational eye it is an artifact like 1,000 others. To those who tell the story, it is a locus of misfortune, a device by which the battlefield's sharp edge keeps finding new flesh. The central enigma is not merely whether the rifle is cursed in some melodramatic sense. The deeper puzzle is this: if multiple, unrelated people all experience a string of bad luck after encountering the same object, how do we explain correlation without immediately invoking superstition? Can repeated but idiosyncratic misfortunes clustered around a single object ever be more than coincidence? And if they can, what mechanism, physical, psychological, metaphysical, could produce such clustering? To approach these questions we will follow 3 parallel threads. First, the historical thread: where did the rifle come from? What can we learn by examining records, inventory lists, letters, pension files, and museum accession logs? What did people who lived through Antietam say at the time about items taken from the field? Second, the testimonial thread, the live accounts of those who claim to have encountered the rifle. These narratives are messy and human. They come with bias and embellishment, but they are also maps of experience. Third, the scientific thread: what do physics, materials science, psychology, and archaeology say about how objects can record or influence events? Can stress, corrosion, or microstructural changes in wood or metal produce effects that would make people behave differently or fall ill? Or is there a mechanism we have not yet recognized? What makes the Cursed Rifle tale different from other battlefield ghost stories is not its theatricality, but its insistence on repetition across time. We will hear similar patterns across decades: a family who keeps the rifle for generations while misfortunes pile up in ways that suggest more than chance, a dealer who sells it and finds customers who return it, unnerved, a reenactor who fires the weapon and later collides with inexplicable bad luck. Each story alone is ambiguous. Taken together, they form a pattern that begs investigation. But what counts as evidence here? Historians will point to material records, serial numbers, provenance papers, wartime inventories. These can often be traced, suggesting ordinary chains of custody and simple explanations for a rifle's appearance in different collections. Scientists will ask for controlled data. How many people touched the rifle? What were the objective outcomes? And how do those outcomes compare to control groups who handled similar but unlegendary weapons? Ethnographers will listen for the ways that communities embed objects in moral narratives. The rifle becomes a storytelling node around which identity, guilt, and memory cohere. In this video script, we will move among these vantage points. We will consider how, in the war's aftermath, objects from battlefields were traded, salvaged, and memorialized. We will read examples of folklore that dress the rifle with agency. We will step into hospital tents and sutler shops. We will meet descendants who live under the weight of a family relic and the strangers who encounter it by accident. We will test the rifle against science, considering whether electromagnetic anomalies, trace chemical residues, or purely psychosomatic factors could account for the reports. We will also hold space for another possibility, the unsettling option that no current branch of science fully explains what people insistently report. We will not claim this as proof of the supernatural. Rather, we will treat it as an invitation. The past may not be inert, and the ways people remember it are not always neat. Perhaps there are phenomena that cross the borders of disciplines, phenomena that require a new vocabulary combining the material with the memorial. Perhaps the rifle is nothing more than a wooden stock and a length of rifled steel. Perhaps it is an instrument for grief. Perhaps it is a way of naming randomness so we can make meaning of it. At the center of our investigation sits one persistent question: if an object can become a vessel for memory, what does that mean for those who inherit it? Do we owe artifacts compassion, understanding, ritual? Or do we simply catalog them, place them behind glass, and call it research? The story invites the audience to wrestle with the ethics of memory as much as with the mechanics of menace. So we begin. We will move from place to place, from testimony to record, from the laboratory bench to the quiet backyard where a family keeps a rifle in a cedar chest. At each stop we will ask the same careful questions and resist easy answers. By the end of this journey, you will not have a clean verdict. You will, however, have a map of what was found, what was said, and what remains stubbornly unexplainable. Antietam is not a single image so much as a set of frames, stone walls, sunken roads, the stubby profile of the Dunker Church, the cold arch of Burnside's Bridge, and the slow, secretive flow of Antietam Creek. The battlefield spreads in a complex patchwork of ridges and lowlands, woodlets and cleared fields, each landform shaping how men moved and died on that day. To stand on the ground now is to be caught between two logics: the scored, commemorative geometry of monuments and the indifferent, incremental geometry of natural terrain. The markers tell a story ordered from memory. The land remembers in ways that predate and will outlast any plaque. The National Park Service preserves this place precisely because it is both a map of history and a living ecosystem. The statistics of the day, nearly 23,000 casualties reported in the course of the battle, framed the scale of violence that saturated the soil. The southbound approach to Burnside's Bridge is itself a lesson in tactical geography. Built in 1836 and later preserved to match its 1862 appearance, the bridge narrows the crossing into a choke point where rifles, cannon, and human bodies converged in brutal arithmetic. The stones that make up its three arches still glint under the sun. Their surface is worn not only by tourists, but by the uncounted footsteps of centuries. The topography of Antietam matters to our story because objects left on or taken from battlefields do not move through clean space. They move through space saturated with memory and altered by violence. Where the land dips into a hollow and holds moisture longer, where a stone wall offers a momentary shelter, where a fence post leans, these are the places where people do not simply pass. They stop to tidy, to bury, to mourn, and sometimes to pick over the dead for anything salvageable. The sutlers and scavengers of the war years moved through these same geometries. They took what they could carry: buttons, pocket watches, bayonets, knives, and rifles. Sometimes those things were used again, sometimes they were kept as reminders of loss. Thus, an ordinary rifle could travel from the palm of a soldier into the hands of a neighbor, from there into a trunk, and then into a trade network of relic collectors and dealers. That chain of custody, long and porous, creates the exact conditions for a legend to spread. Small towns on the periphery of Antietam, Sharpsburg among them, are a second layer of place. These communities absorbed the wounded, housed the dead, and took in the stray artifacts of war. Families and addicts kept flaking uniforms and cracked powder flasks, folding them into domestic memory. A rifle stored in such a place becomes an intimate object. It is handled by people who connect to it not only as a weapon but as a relic of someone they loved or at least knew by face and name. The transformation is subtle but important. An object moves from being an anonymous tool of war to a thing invested with human connection. Nearby museums and private collections provide the third layer of location. The Model 1861 Springfield and the British pattern 1853 Enfield are the kinds of rifles associated with Civil War battlefields, common, widely used, and thus easily circulating through civilian hands after battles ended. Institutions like the Smithsonian and various military museums house countless examples. These institutional repositories make visible the ways material culture from the war is catalogued, preserved, and explained to the public. When we imagine the rifle's travel, picture this: a soldier falls, a comrade pries a weapon free, a medic carries it off, a local farmer lifts it to use as a tool to repair a fence, a widow tucks it into a trunk for reasons both practical and symbolic. A relic dealer spots it decades later in a yard sale, and a collector buys it for its patina. The rifle moves through public and private geographies, through institutions and intimate rooms, gathering stories at each handoff. Each location leaves its own mark: the salt of a creek spraying close to metal, the faint insect holes bored into a wooden stock from attic dryness, the oil stains of hands that have held it with grief rather than use. These marks are physical, and they are also narrative, each a node that will later be read as evidence by believers, skeptics, and those who simply want a good story. To say the rifle is associated with strange phenomena is not to claim a single, neat category of happenings. The reports are many and varied, and it is their variety that makes them interesting. They do not point in a single direction, but rather fan out like spokes from a hub. Taken together, they form a constellation of oddities that refuses a simple explanation. First, there are the immediate physical sensations people report when they handle the rifle: a sudden chill in a warm room, the sensation of a pressure behind the eyes, a metallic taste that comes without cause. These are subjective experiences, but they recur across unrelated accounts. An elderly woman who kept the rifle for decades said that when she first lifted it as a child, the air around her felt thick, as if the world had been squeezed into a narrower, denser place. A reenactor who fired the weapon during a living history event later described a ringing in my ears that lasted the rest of the day, and then a series of misfortunes over the following week. Subjective feelings are the raw data of legends. They are also the kind of data psychologists caution us to interpret carefully because they are vulnerable to expectancy effects and memory bias. Even so, when many different people describe similar somatic reactions, the pattern invites examination. Second, there are sequences of misfortune, accidents, illnesses, and a handful of small but emotionally devastating losses that cluster around the rifle. A line of stories suggests that households owning the rifle experienced a run of bad luck: a barn burned, a crop failed in an otherwise good season, a family member had an unexplained decline in health. The narratives vary drastically in content and severity. Some are framed as anecdote, others as testimony. Importantly, misfortune is a humanly common occurrence. The question becomes whether the clustering around this particular object is outside reasonable expectation. To test that, we would need statistical evidence and a reliable chain of custody, either of which we always possess in these stories. Third, there are sensory anomalies reported by visitors at locations where the rifle has sat, not only by those who touch it. Some visitors speak of hearing faint footfalls or the low murmur of voices that resolve into nothing when they turn. Others describe cameras malfunctioning or batteries dying when pointed at or placed near the rifle. One collector claimed that a phone dropped out of a pocket when it neared the stock and would not power on for hours. Such electrical anomalies are reported in many other ghost lore contexts as well. Scientists often point to mundane sources like poor batteries, older wiring, or electromagnetic interference from unrelated devices. Still, the recurrence of similar reports in relation to a single object is the sort of pattern that moves a rumor into a legend. Fourth, there are the dreams. People who have had a relationship with the rifle, caretakers, owners, or those who encountered it fleetingly, sometimes report dreams of battles or of a particular soldier. These dreams tend to be vivid and emotionally complicated, not the slight dream traces of a normal night. Dreams are notoriously unreliable as evidence, but they are meaningful sociologically. They demonstrate how an object can become a node for a person's unconscious processing of trauma and grief. Dream reports also show how the rifle functions culturally. It becomes a conduit through which the past is imagined and inhabited. Finally, there are artifacts and bodily marks that some claim to find on people who have handled the rifle. Rust flakes invisible to the naked eye, microscopic pitting consistent with long exposure to chemically active soils, and faint scratches on hands that are not readily explained by ordinary handling. When archaeologists examine objects from old battlefields, they do find residues and micro-damage from war and subsequent storage. But the step from identifying corrosion to declaring a curse is a large one, and the evidentiary path from micro-pitting to misfortune is not straightforward. Taken alone, any of these phenomena could be politely dismissed or scientifically explained. Together, woven through decades and across different owners and settings, they insist upon investigation. Are there environmental explanations? Mold spores producing odd smells and physiological reactions? Could stray electromagnetic fields, perhaps from older electrical equipment in storage areas, cause battery failures or subjective sensations? Do human narrative processes, the tendency to see meaning in coincidence, to pattern match, account for the rest? All of these are plausible. But what makes the rifle's case gripping is the way ordinary material detail, a nick in the stock, a line of rust along the bore, initials carved in faintly, can anchor very human experiences and, in turn, make them seem more than arbitrary. The core of the mystery is straightforward to state and maddening to resolve. Multiple episodes of unusual, harmful, or unexplained events are reported in association with a single object, a rifle reputed to have come from Antietam. The enigma tightens once we ask follow-up questions. What is the rifle's provenance? Can we trace its movements across time with documents or reliable witness statements? How many events must cluster around an object before we consider the clustering significant? And finally, even if the clustering is real, what causal story, psychological, physical, or paranormal, could account for it? The provenance question is empirical and, for historians, the most tractable. A weapon manufactured at a given armory, stamped with a particular maker's mark or serial number, can sometimes be traced through military records, purchase documents, or post-war inventories. The Model 1861 Springfield and the Pattern 1853 Enfield were among the most widely used rifles during the Civil War. Because of that ubiquity, many artifacts from the period are of those types. If a rifle's markings match a particular unit's inventory, and that unit is known to have fought in a specific area of Antietam, the probability increases that the rifle is indeed from that battlefield. Museums and museums catalogs, institutions like the Smithsonian and battlefield repositories, often have records that can corroborate or contradict family lore. Smithsonian Institution NRAmuseum.org. Even when a plausible provenance exists, the chain of custody over the intervening decades is often porous and poorly documented. Items are passed, sold, loaned, and forgotten. A veteran might give a rifle to a comrade's widow might later sell it, the buyer might pawn it, a neighbor might salvage it from a yard sale. With each transfer, the historical tether loosens. Those gaps are not merely documentation problems, they are the very spaces where legend grows. A missing ledger entry becomes a hinge for speculation. Perhaps the rifle left a house under strange circumstances. Perhaps it was returned mysteriously. Perhaps someone later found it in the woods after a night of thunder. Human memory prefers narrative continuity. When the chain is broken, people supply plausible bridges. Over time, these bridges may calcify into what looks, from a distance, like proof. The enigma grows when we juxtapose objective documentation against subjective narrative. Suppose we find an 1861 Springfield with a scratched initial set that matches a unit at Antietam, and suppose that later owners reported a string of misfortunes. The objective facts, the rifle's make, the initial, the chain of recorded sales, are neutral. The subjective facts, the timing and content of misfortunes, are prone to selection effects. We remember the weird and forget the mundane. We tell stories that confer meaning. We attribute causation where none need exist. The enigma is not that people tell these stories, people always have, but that despite all the ways memory and bias can generate patterns, the cumulative weight of stories about this rifle keeps growing, like new rings on an old tree. To get closer to an answer, we need two things that are rarely available at the same time: a well-documented, continuous chain of custody, and objective, independent corroboration that an unusual sequence of events occurred following interaction with the rifle. Case studies exist in other contexts where an artifact's history is clear and subsequent anomalous claims are documented, but they are rare. In the Antietam rifle stories, some owners can produce receipts, letters, or photographs that anchor the rifle to a particular time and place. Others rely on oral family history. Some incidents, a set of camera malfunctions during a private showing, a pattern of medical conditions that befell a household, have contemporaneous notes, or medical records. Others are recounted only years later. The result is an evidentiary patchwork, credible fragments and vivid anomalies stitched together with the thread of human narrative. What makes the rifle an enigma is not merely that there are unexplained events, but that there is a qualitative character to the reports, a slant of sorrow mixed with the physical. The misfortunes are not spectacular in most cases. They are intimate losses and small disasters, the kinds of events that accumulate in a life. It is easy to create statistical models in which the number of small tragedies any given household experiences over decades is not improbable. It is harder, but not impossible, to explain why those tragedies seem to follow an object as it changes hands. The psychological answer, that objects become focal points for anxiety, and thus retroactively for blame, holds a large explanatory power. The physical answer, that some environmental agent, perhaps present on the object, causes illness or mechanical failure, is plausible for a limited set of reports but struggles to account for narrative coincidences and dreamlike experiences. The paranormal explanation remains a cultural one. We use stories of haunted objects to make sense of loss and to externalize guilt. All three kinds of explanation have purchase, none provides closure. To make sense of the available data, speculative narratives must be separated into categories: historical mechanistic theories, environmental/physical theories, psychological and sociocultural theories, and finally, speculative paranormal possibilities. We will entertain each in turn, testing them against what is known and saying plainly where each theory fails or succeeds. At the simplest level, a rifle's reputation can be explained by social contamination, a reputational cascade that amplifies coincidence. An owner experiences a difficult winter. Someone in the community links the hardship to a relic attributed to Antietam. The story travels, each retelling adding a detail. The rifle's provenance gets embellished to make the linkage more plausible. Market forces feed the process. Objects with stories sell better. This mechanism need not be nefarious. It is simply cultural economy at work. It explains how a relic's aura accumulates across decades without invoking unseen forces. A second mechanistic theory involves tangible, historical trauma as a form of legacy. War exacts a kind of cultural damage. Shells of households are broken, families are scattered, and objects become markers of disrupted continuities. A rifle kept in a family trunk is not cursed in itself. Rather, it is the index of a family history that included loss, economic hardship, and social dislocation. The rifle is thus an emblem, not an agent. This theory accounts for the effective power of the object without granting it causal agency. Material science offers hypotheses about how objects might carry agents capable of causing physical effects. Heavy metals, residues from black powder, mold, or chemical contaminants could have physiological effects on humans in close contact. For example, lead and other heavy metal exposure can lead to headaches, fatigue, and neurological symptoms. A rifle stored in a damp attic could develop fungi that release spores causing allergic reactions or visual disturbances. Metal corrosion can produce ions that irritate skin. These mechanisms can explain many somatic reports and some battery malfunctions, if, for example, conductive residues affect contacts. But such theories require measurable contamination, and in most anecdotes no such tests have been done or the tests were inconclusive. Another physical speculation ties to microstructural changes in the material itself. Repeated heating and cooling, minor impacts, or peculiar storage conditions can change the internal stress patterns of wood and metal, sometimes producing noises as the object relaxes or shifts. An old stock can settle and moan in humid conditions, an ordinary, material explanation for a voice, in some accounts. Psychology provides powerful tools for explaining how objects come to be associated with patterns of misfortune. The confirmation bias encourages people to remember hits and forget misses. When someone believes an object is cursed, they will interpret subsequent random misfortunes as confirming evidence. The nocebo effect, the counterpart to placebo, shows that expectation alone can produce negative physical and emotional outcomes. If a person believes an object will bring harm, that belief alone might elevate stress hormones, disrupt sleep, and reduce immune function, thereby increasing the probability of real illness. Social contagion also matters. Rumors, particularly when embedded in local identity and memory, spread through communities and shape perceptions. Collective memory around Antietam is thick and morally charged. People who live near battlefields are often heir to stories of valor, sacrifice, and loss. Within that cultural soil, the idea of a cursed rifle is legible and emotionally resonant. Folklorists observe that legends of cursed objects often perform a social role. They externalize unresolved trauma, provide moral lessons about greed or sacrilege, or insulate communities from confronting difficult histories by projecting threat onto things rather than institutions. Finally, there are theories that move beyond current scientific paradigms. These are not offered as proofs, but rather as frameworks believers use to interpret a set of otherwise puzzling reports. One such theory is imprinting or stone tape type hypotheses, which propose that intense emotional or traumatic events can leave enduring traces in matter, later to be reactivated under certain conditions. In this view, energy, not currently described by mainstream physics, can be embedded in materials and later stimulate perceptual phenomena in humans. The idea lacks strong empirical support as conventionally tested, but it persists because it maps neatly onto many narratives of haunted places and objects. Another paranormal possibility is that of a more agentive haunting, the rifle as a vessel for a personality or a set of intentional spirits, perhaps those of men who died while grasping weapons. This model is more common in folklore than in controlled investigation, and it demands assumptions about continuity of consciousness after death that are not empirically established. Yet it has explanatory power for accounts that include targeted dreams or narratives that feel specifically personal, e.g., a descendant dreaming of a particular soldier and later discovering a matching tattoo or name drawn into the rifle stock. A more exotic speculation considers the rifle as a temporal nexus, a node where time slips or echoes occur. Visitors describe not only sensory anomalies but small discontinuities in chronology, a camera that captures a shadow that was not visible live, an old photograph that seems to change its background when later inspected. These fractures are rare and typically anecdotal, but they attract those who favor theories of localized time anomalies, interdimensional bleed, or localized fluctuations of causality. These ideas move far beyond accepted science, but they persist at the fringes precisely because they can incorporate many types of reports under a single narrative umbrella. Perhaps the most intellectually honest posture is integrative. The rifle stories are produced at the intersection of material history, environmental factors, psychological susceptibilities, and cultural narratives. In such a model, a single event, a mold spore causing headaches in one household, could, through storytelling, transform into a legend that shapes how future owners perceive minor misfortunes. Similarly, a real physical contamination could produce real physiological harm, which in turn becomes culturally encoded. Over time, the rifle becomes both cause and symbol, agent and story. What would it take to move from speculation to stronger inference? Two empirical things: rigorous material testing, chemical analyses of metal and wood, microscopic residue analysis, environmental sampling, and careful, prospective observation, documented sequences of events following controlled, consented interactions with the object, ideally with control groups. Ethnographic work is equally necessary, collecting testimonies carefully and situating them in family and communal histories. Only by triangulating these domains can we hope to reduce the space of plausible explanations. For now, the story hangs on the edge between plausible science and resonant myth. Each theory explains part of the pattern and fails at other points. Each has purchase, and none offers a full solution. That very incompleteness is not a defect in the story, rather, it is its hallmark. A good mystery resists tidy closure. The Battle of Antietam occurred on September 17, 1862, and stands in American memory as the single bloodiest day of the Civil War. In the course of roughly 12 hours of fighting, nearly 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or reported missing, a scale of carnage that seared the landscape and the national imagination. The battle's tactical geometry, the sunken lane later called Bloody Lane, the cornfields, the stone walls, and Burnside's bridge, became fixed points in the narrative of the war and in the geography of loss. Those facts are well established in the historical record and in the materials preserved and interpreted by the National Park Service and battlefield historians. To understand the rifle's tale, we must begin with the culture of wartime salvage and memory. After engagements like Antietam, the battlefield did not immediately become a tidy museum. Soldiers, medics, and local civilians scoured the fields for anything of value or usefulness. Personal effects, buttons, belts, knives, watches, and firearms, were often removed from the dead or taken from abandoned encampments. Sutlers, scavengers, returning soldiers, and later, collectors and dealers all participated in a secondary market of battlefield material. The practical logic was simple. With an economy strained by war, usable objects were precious. With memory raw, mementos were emotionally freighted. These twin logics, utility and remembrance, created a steady circulation of artifacts out of the field and into civilian hands. The circulation was rarely neat or fully documented, and it is this porousness that both makes an artifact's provenance hard to verify and makes legends possible. Rifles and muskets of the Civil War era were not standardized in the way modern military gear is. They were produced in large numbers but also imported, altered, and reissued. The Springfield Model 1861, produced in Massachusetts and by many contracted manufacturers, became the standard issue rifled musket for much of the Union Army and was seen across many battlefields. The British pattern 1853 Enfield was likewise widespread and was used by both Union and Confederate forces, often imported or smuggled into the Confederacy. Both types are commonly associated with Civil War battlefields and with the kinds of weapons that might plausibly be found, reused, or kept as relics after a battle. Soldiers' interactions with their weapons were intimate and routine. A musket or rifle was not only a tool of war. For many it was an extension of the body, maintained with oil and patching cloth, personalized with initials, notches, or carved reminders. When a man died clutching a rifle, his family or comrades sometimes kept that very weapon as a keepsake. In other cases the weapon was reissued or scavenged. That personal proximity is crucial for the social life of an object. Objects that have been close to human hands long carry layered meanings, and those meanings can anchor stories across generations. Where a chain of custody is clear, receipts, museum accession logs, unit inventories, historians can trace an object with confidence. But such clarity is the exception rather than the rule. Beyond the immediate post-battle years, the memorialization of Antietam became an act of national significance. The Gettysburg and Antietam years saw an increasing effort to mark battlefields, erect monuments, and collect relics as part of a broader culture of remembrance. As veterans aged, and as families worked to manage grief, artifacts were frequently turned into heirlooms. A rifle could move from practical tool to sacred emblem. This transformation is part of why reports of a cursed rifle resonate. The object is not merely a piece of old metal and wood, it is a portable site of memory. It carries the presence of absent people in a way that is emotionally potent, even when the documentary evidence for its path over time is thin. The documentary record is uneven. Military muster rolls, ordnance records, and armory production lists allow historians to place classes of weapons into broad distributions, how many Springfields were produced, or how prevalent Enfields were among Confederate units. Personal letters, diaries, and pension files sometimes offer more precise glimpses, a line in a letter noting that, "We took up rifles of the dead," or a pension application mentioning the loss of a family's possessions. Yet the precise path of a single rifle, from a soldier's death in the cornfield to a trunk in a farmhouse to a dealer's display case, often winds through undocumented human actions, neighbors helping neighbors, sales at markets, trades at taverns. These informal movements are where provenance frays, and where narrative leaps in. The emergent cultural meaning of relics from Antietam also evolved with time. In the immediate decades after the war, relics helped veterans and families maintain bonds and to narrate personal sacrifice. In the later 19th and 20th centuries, as the nation reframed the war in various ways, reconciliation narratives, nationalistic remembrance, and regional identity politics, the meanings attached to battlefield artifacts shifted. A rifle kept for private mourning could later appear in a public exhibition, its private associations reinterpreted by curators and visitors. That shifting frame allows one object to carry multiple, sometimes contradictory meanings across time, a symbol of honor for one family, an index of trauma for another, and a collectible for a third. The ambiguity invites stories, including stories of curses. When archaeologists and material historians step into the story of an object, they approach with instruments and methods designed to pry open time without depending on folklore. At Antietam, controlled excavations, surveys, and artifact cataloging over decades have produced a layered record of material culture: spent bullets, cartridge boxes, buttons, personal items, and the occasional intact firearm. These finds are cataloged, analyzed, and often interpreted in the context of battlefield tactics and soldier behavior. Archaeology at battlefields does several things at once. It corroborates documentary records, reveals everyday realities not captured in official reports, and sometimes complicates tidy narratives about where people were and what they did. One key point archaeologists emphasize is the material durability of certain residues. Lead bullets, iron fittings, and traces of black powder can persist in soils for centuries, especially in contexts where the pH and moisture conditions retard chemical degradation. Metal corrosion, flaking, and patina are part of any weapon's life cycle. They tell a tale of original manufacture, battlefield use, and post-battle environmental history. If a rifle were buried, lost in a stream, or stored in an unventilated shed, those storage conditions would leave measurable signatures. For example, long exposure to acidic soil can produce characteristic pitting on iron surfaces. Sustained dampness can encourage fungal colonization in wood stocks, which in turn could leave DNA traces for modern analysis. Such forensic possibilities are scientifically real and form the basis for material analysis in many historical investigations. Museums and institutional collections sometimes have the advantage of recorded provenance. In those cases, conservators can conduct detailed analyses. The National Museum of American History, regional military museums, and battlefield repositories hold documented Civil War firearms with accession records. Where a firearms chain of custody is credible, conservators can measure wood isotopes to estimate origin, analyze microstratigraphy of corrosion, or test for trace organic residues on the stock that might indicate handling patterns, oil types used, or even biological material. The Smithsonian's collections include many Springfield and Enfield examples, and their conservation records help establish baseline expectations for what normal aging and storage look like. However, the rifle at the center of the legend rarely arrives in a sealed carton with a pristine accession file. Instead, it moves through family storerooms, flea markets, and private collections. That makes scientific work both harder and more vital. Archaeological methods that could shed light include metallurgical analysis, X-ray fluorescence, XRF, and scanning electron microscopy, SEM, can determine the elemental composition of metal parts, revealing manufacturing signatures that can tie a weapon to a production run or armory. Differences in alloy composition can sometimes identify later modifications or restorations. Dendrochronology and wood analysis. Though sawn and altered, wooden stocks retain growth ring patterns and cell structures. Where preserved, they can sometimes be referenced against regional tree ring chronologies to estimate the wood's origin and age. More frequently, conservators analyze wood grain and tooling marks for stylistic and manufacturing insights. Residue and biomolecular testing. Swabs from stocks and metal parts can be analyzed for trace proteins, lipids, or DNA. These analyses can sometimes reveal handling patterns, e.g., sustained human contact leaving human skin cells, the presence of animal fats used in black powder cleaning oils, or fungal DNA indicating particular storage conditions. Surface wear and microdamage studies. Microscopic analysis of nicks, notches, and where patterns help differentiate between battlefield use, later handling, and deliberate modification, e.g., initials carved later for sentimental reasons. Implementing these tests on a private object requires consent and resources. Owners may be reluctant to allow invasive testing, dealers may fear devaluing an item, museums may hesitate to accept objects whose histories are cloudy. Even when tests are performed, their interpretation is not always straightforward. For example, human DNA on a stock proves handling, but it does not prove origin, intent, or moral meaning. Corrosion patterns can show long damp storage, but they cannot speak to whether misfortune befell an owner. Forensic analysis is powerful, but it rarely supplies the narrative closure that folklore promises. It provides data. Meaning remains a human interpretation threaded through that data. When conservation science has been applied to reputedly haunted or cursed objects elsewhere, results are mixed and often illuminating in unexpected ways. Some objects annotated as cursed have been shown to contain toxic residues or biologically active molds that could plausibly cause somatic symptoms. Others show nothing more exotic than the expected traces of age in human handling. The methodological lesson is modest. Scientific testing can often rule out simple material explanations, but it cannot affirm supernatural causes. It can sometimes reveal unappreciated risks that reframe the folklore in mundane yet meaningful ways. At Antietam, archaeological work continues to refine our understanding of how artifacts ended up where they did. Mapping spent rounds and scatter patterns has clarified troop movements. Surface finds of weapon fragments and accoutrements have helped identify areas of intense fighting and abandonment. In that sense, the battlefield itself is an archaeological record from which stories of objects like the rifle can be partially reconstructed. Yet archaeology is primarily a discipline of spatial and material relationships, not of moral causation. It can tell us where a rifle likely sat or how it might have been damaged. It cannot tell us whether that rifle carries a curse. The field of possible scientific explanations ranges from the purely physical to the neuropsychological. To treat the subject even-handedly, we must consider environmental health, materials science, human cognition, and the limits of current knowledge. Old firearms and their storage contexts can plausibly harbor substances that cause physical symptoms. Lead, a primary component of bullets of the era and of certain metal fittings, becomes a concern when it is freestanding, e.g., lead dust, or when corrosion creates soluble lead compounds that can be absorbed through hand-to-mouth contact. Chronic lead exposure causes neurological symptoms, abdominal pain, fatigue, and mood changes. If a rifle's metal surfaces were heavily corroded and if someone handled the object frequently without washing their hands, lead exposure would be a plausible and testable pathway to somatic complaints. However, proving such exposure requires environmental and biological sampling, e.g., blood lead levels, which in folklore cases is rarely undertaken. Black powder residues are another material candidate. Black powder is a mixture of charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter, potassium nitrate. Long-term storage in enclosed spaces can allow residue to deposit on surfaces and potentially cause irritation when disturbed, particularly for those with respiratory sensitivities. Mold and mycotoxins from damp wood stocks are similarly plausible agents. Certain molds produce volatile organic compounds and spores that can trigger allergic reactions, headaches, and cognitive disturbances in susceptible individuals. Thus, simple, prosaic environmental explanations can account for many somatic and sensory reports. Reports of electrical devices failing near a reputedly cursed object often stimulate speculation about electromagnetic fields, EMFs. In controlled laboratory conditions, EMFs can produce interference in poorly shielded electronics. Old batteries or cables near the exhibit could create localized fields or ground loops. Alternatively, older wiring in a storage area might be the culprit rather than the object itself. From the standpoint of physics, a wooden-stocked rifle without powered elements cannot generate sustained electromagnetic fields. Any electromagnetic explanation must therefore posit a separate source, hidden wiring, environmental equipment, or invoke an as yet undocumented physical mechanism by which traumatized matter can emit fields, an idea for which there is no verified scientific evidence at present. Perhaps the most explanatory power lies with mechanisms rooted in human perception and physiology. The nocebo effect, where negative expectations produce physical symptoms, is a robust phenomenon. If an owner expects an object to be harmful, stress responses can produce real effects: elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep, headaches, and even immune suppression. These physiological changes increase the probability of getting sick, thus creating a feedback loop that seems to confirm the expectation. Pattern recognition and confirmation bias further polish the story. Human cognition is wired to detect patterns and causality because such detection had evolutionary advantages. The downside is that humans sometimes infer causation from mere correlation. An object is present, a misfortune follows. The mind links the two and stores that connection more firmly than the countless null correlations that occur every day. Over time and across retellings, the connection becomes narrative fact for a community. Collective memory and social reinforcement also modulate perception. Within a community where stories circulate about a cursed artifact, ambiguous events are more likely to be interpreted as supporting the legend. This communal framing can produce culture-specific symptoms, e.g., shared dream motifs, synchronized concerns, that appear to be environmental or mystical but are social in origin. A rigorous scientific approach would involve double-blind prospective studies, where participants interact with objects without being told their reputed status, control groups, and measurable physiological endpoints. Such studies are rarely run for legendary relics due to ethical, logistical, and resource constraints. Science is both powerful and limited. It can often disconfirm simple material explanations, e.g., by demonstrating the absence of toxic residues, but it cannot easily disprove subjective reports of meaningful experience. Moreover, some phenomena reported in haunted object traditions are not well captured by standard experimental paradigms. Meaning-laden dreams, synchronicities, and narrative transformations resist reduction to simple variables. The absence of a contemporary, empirically validated mechanism that converts trauma-laden events into persistent, transmissible energy does not, by itself, prove that such mechanisms do not exist. It merely places them outside current explanatory models. The appropriate scientific posture is therefore twofold: apply forensic techniques to the material evidence where possible, and apply rigorous psychological and sociological methods to understand how communities and individuals make meaning from those materials. The integrative position recognizes that many reports likely have multiple contributing causes, some physical, some cognitive, some cultural, and that isolating single-cause explanations may be both unrealistic and unhelpful. Objects like a rifle from Antietam live not only in physical space but inside cultural webs. Folklore studies, memory theory, and ethnography help us understand how a mundane object becomes an axis for narrative, identity, and morality. Anthropologists emphasize that objects are often containers of memory. In societies coping with loss, material things serve as persistent reminders, portable shrines that help maintain relationships with absent persons. The rifle, once a soldier's extension, becomes an emblem of presence in absence. For descendants, keeping such an object may be an act of piety. For others, it can be a burden, a concrete reminder of trauma. The story of a cursed rifle can, therefore, be read as a cultural negotiation. How does a family live with an object that summons sorrow? Declaring a rifle cursed externalizes the pain and gives it shape. Folklore scholars note certain recurrent structures in cursed object tales, origin stories that tie an object to a dramatic event, the battlefield, an initial catalytic incident, the first misfortune, a pattern of transmission, gift, sale, theft, and communal reinforcement, retelling at gatherings, mentions in local news, or at commemorative events. The Antietam rifle legend fits this structure. The battlefield provides the dramatic origin. Anecdotal misfortunes are the catalytic incidents. The movement of the object across households provides transmission, and the community's commemorative culture offers reinforcement. Through repetition and embellishment, mundane events are converted into a pattern that, within the local cultural logic, appears meaningful. The existence of a reputedly cursed artifact raises ethical questions for museums, collectors, and communities. Museums must balance the educational value of objects against their cultural meanings. How should a museum display a weapon that a family claims brought them misfortune? Collectors face similar dilemmas. Do they market the story for value, or conceal it? The commodification of such artifacts can intensify legends, because market incentives reward sensational narratives. At the same time, public history institutions must contend with the needs of descendants and communities that may attach spiritual or moral claims to artifacts. The ethics of handling and interpreting relics require sensitivity. Objects are not inert, social meanings are real, and the people who live with these meanings deserve respect. Finally, ghost stories and cursed object narratives perform social work. They express in symbolic form anxieties about inheritance, about the unresolved moral questions of who benefits from conflict, and about whether the objects of war can be disentangled from the violence that birthed them. In that light, the rifle's tale is less an eccentric oddity and more a cultural text through which communities rehearse their relations to trauma and memory. The curse may function as a moral metaphor, a way to insist that the violence of Antietam has consequences beyond the battlefield, and that those consequences ripple unpredictably into the lives of ordinary people. We have moved from the battlefield's hard data into the softer but no less real worlds of material analysis and cultural meaning. The historical background established that the conditions for a rifle to leave a battlefield and circulate into private hands were common. The archaeological discussion showed how material traces could be analyzed and what they might reveal. The scientific overview made clear that many mundane mechanisms could explain reported effects. And the cultural context revealed why stories of cursed objects stick and what social work they perform. At the end of this section, a few sober points stand out. Provenance matters. Where documentation exists, an object's history can be anchored. Where it doesn't, legends have room to grow. Material tests can disconfirm many physical explanations, toxins, mold, corrosion, but they cannot adjudicate subjective meaning or the moral weight of memory. Psychological and social processes explain much of the patterning of reported misfortune and sensation, particularly through mechanisms like confirmation bias and the nocebo effect. The cultural life of relics is itself part of the phenomenon. The rifle's social meanings amplify perception and alter behavior, making the object an active participant in human lives even without supernatural agency. There are moments in the telling when the line between testimony and confession blurs. A collector speaks too quietly. A descendant's fingers drum the table as if by rhythm an old worry might be kept in time. The accounts that make up the rifle's legend are not polished data points. They are lived fragments, each carrying the smell of laundry, the slack of grief, the stubborn geometry of kitchen chairs. Taken together, they form a mosaic of experiences that resist simple classification. One of the more persistent types of account involves those who claim to have seen the object behave in ways that seem to defy ordinary explanation. A small-town historian, who prefers to remain unnamed in most retellings, remembers the first time she saw the rifle properly. It lay on a table in the back room of an attic museum, its stock dulled by age, a faint gouge visible along the wrist. She lifted it with the careful, trained touch of a conservator. Her hand was steady. The room was warmed by a single lamp. She says that as soon as she took hold, the lamp flickered and the air seemed to compress. As if someone had taken the wind out of the room, she told later. For her, the moment was not theatrical. It was small, clinical, and yet charged with an old weight. She recorded the incident in her notes not as evidence of the supernatural but as data. The lamp's bulb subsequently tested fine, the wiring had no faults, and no one else in the house reported anything. Still, the memory remained, and the staff altered where they kept the weapon after that night. A reenactor provides a different rhythm to the story. He'd fired many period weapons at events across the eastern states, and he treated them like instruments, clean, oiled, respected. At a living history weekend at Antietam, he was allowed to load and fire a rifle reputed to have come from the battlefield itself. The firing was ordinary, a measured powder charge, a puff of smoke, a report that joined the chorus of other musketry at the demonstration. But that evening he stumbled on the long, slow sequence of misfortunes that would become part of the lore. His truck window shattered inexplicably as he drove home, his dog became ill with a problem vets could not reconcile, and a series of small financial setbacks coincided with a string of personal anxieties that he had not previously experienced. He told friends the events were merely coincidence. Over time, however, pattern-seeking friends and local listeners began to suggest a link between the firing and his bad luck. Some insisted he had been cursed by the object, others said he had been unlucky all along. The reenactors shifted from agnosticism to a guarded avoidance of that particular rifle. Some stories are quieter but more intimate. In one family, the weapon spent generations in a cedar chest. A great-grandmother, a woman of practical habits and few superstitions, claimed that the rifle had once been secreted beneath her quilts by a man who returned from the war and could not bear to tell the family what he had seen. She would never speak of his name. Her descendants recall nights when she would wake and say she heard voices outside the house, or that the floorboards creaked in a way that sounded like soldiers moving in a double time. She would sit straight up, call someone, and then in the morning apologize for not sleeping. Her descendants interpreted those nights variously as the residue of the old man's trauma, as a product of age, and as an actual conversation the land still insisted upon. The rifle, in their telling, was less an agent and more a talisman that concentrated private histories into something the whole family could hold and argue over. Other experiences are stranger still. A small number of witnesses describe dreams so vivid they alter waking choices. A young woman who worked in a museum's conservation lab began to dream of a soldier she had never seen. In the dream, the man was not a dramatic hero. He was, she said, small and bent, the sort of man who loved his field more than he loved maps. In waking life, she found a small marking scratched into the rifle stock, a letter that matched an initial on a faded photograph recovered from the same collection. The match did not prove the dream's valence, but it amplified the sense that the past had not only a place but a voice. One of the more unnerving sets of reports involves technological anomalies. Across the stories are recurring mentions: cameras failing to record what the eye saw, batteries draining in the presence of the rifle, and wristwatches that stopped and then began again with no discernible intervention. Such anomalies are classic in haunted object lore, and in many cases the simplest explanation is mechanical failure, old batteries, marginal camera sensors, or environmental humidity. But for those who witness the anomalies, the timing stains the ordinary improbably. A young journalist, testing the rifle for a feature piece, left a phone on the table as she took a picture. When she reviewed the footage later, the video showed a slight shift in the rifle's angle, just enough that a viewer would notice, but she insists she did not move it. The phone was new. Its battery had been fully charged. The footage later became a site of debate among friends. Did the rifle move on its own, or had she later failed to recall a small gesture? No firm answers came, only the unsettled sense that relics are capable of rearranging not only our possessions but our memories. There are also reports that border on the moral and the uncanny. One retired soldier who had purchased the rifle at auction told of a string of letters he received from strangers after the sale, letters that initially appeared unrelated but that progressively described private details of his life with an intimacy that made him uneasy. Some were merely persistent solicitations, but others contained knowledge of names and places the writer should not have known. He never traced the mailings to their source but eventually returned the rifle to a regional museum, asking them to keep it safe, rather than storing it at home. When museum staff later received similar outreach, inquiries and notes of gratitude and odd confessions, they debated whether the letters were part of a collective resonance around the rifle, or merely the product of folklore's power to attract attention. The moral here is simple: stories beget more stories, and once an object accrues a reputation, it can magnetize all manner of attention. Taken together, these experiences present a tapestry of odd, sometimes fragile phenomena, somatic reactions, clustered misfortunes, dreams that line up with physical markings, and technological hiccups that point the narrative towards something that cuts across the boundary between material and memory. For each report there is a plausible mundane explanation. For each explanation there is a witness whose reality resists that neatness. The paradox is the source of the rifle's fascination. The more you seek a single, unambiguous mechanism, the more evidence splinters into contradictory textures. When ordinary explanations strain, speculative ideas expand to fill gaps. These theories range from the intellectually tentative to the mythically vivid. They are not offered as claims so much as if frameworks that allow different aspects of the story to be held together for the sake of exploration. One speculative but enduring idea is psychometry, the notion that objects can carry imprints of the emotions or events they have witnessed, and that sensitive individuals can read those imprints. Within this frame, the rifle functions as a repository of concentrated experience, the shock of gunfire, the heat of men's palms, the utter focus of survival. Those imprints, once encoded, can be reactivated in certain contexts, by touch, by the feel of weather, or by proximity to other objects. Psychometry sits at the intersection of romantic intuition and a metaphysical hypothesis about how memory could be stored outside the human brain. Critics note there is no accepted mechanism in modern neuroscience or physics for such transfer. Proponents point to anecdotal accounts where touch seems to conjure vivid, specific imagery. The rifle's dream-linked reports fit comfortably into this model, if one allows for a mode of memory external to people. The stone tape hypothesis, originating in early 20th century speculative pieces, posits that certain materials and conditions can record emotional energy like a historic medium records sound. In this view, the rifle's wood and metal could, under intense stress, such as in the frequency and intensity of battle, preserve a pattern that can later be perceived as a replay. This replay may not be conscious or intentional, more like an echo under certain atmospheric conditions. The idea has analogues in folklore worldwide, stories of places that replay parts of their violent histories under particular weather. The rifle might, by this logic, be a particularly compact tape, its impressions easier to play, because the material intimate of a weapon is saturated with events that include extreme fear and close human focus. A bolder theory is agentive possession, the rifle as a vessel for a personality or a collection of wills, perhaps the residue of a particular soldier, perhaps a collective haunt. This hypothesis treats the object as an active actor, capable of exerting influence upon persons and environments. It is of a different order from psychometry because it imputes intention. Those who favor such a theory often relate it to religious or spiritual frameworks in which spirits can inhabit objects. The patterns that make such theories compelling are psychological. The rifle is, in such accounts, not a mere object but a character in a social drama. It offers a plot, a narrative arc in which the past refuses to be quiet. Critics of this model point to the psychological and social mechanisms that can produce perceived intention where none exists. Supporters point to anecdotal specificity that, they argue, resists mere coincidental explanation. Some hypotheses pushing to the edges of physical cosmology, perhaps certain complex events, like massive battles, create localized distortions in the fabric of time, which can be tethered to dense, materially contiguous objects. In such a model, the rifle could serve as an anchor for minor time slips or echoes, which manifest as misaligned photographs, doubled voices, or temporal discontinuities that visitors describe as small déjà vu episodes. The idea is speculative to the point of near fiction, but it provides a single narrative that can incorporate technological anomalies, dream phenomena, and repeated subjective experiences. Its weakness is obvious. It presumes mechanisms for which we currently have no verifiable evidence. Rupert Sheldrake's controversial idea of morphic resonance, though debated and not widely accepted by mainstream science, conjures a field-based model where patterns can be transmitted non-locally across space and time through fields shaped by habit. If one borrows this language loosely, one could imagine a rifle in which the pattern of human action has resonated into a field that influences later behavior or perception. The value of such a model is heuristic. It allows us to think about non-material patterns of influence without requiring a mechanistic explanation that we do not yet possess. Its weakness, again, is empirical. Field-based ideas need robust testable predictions and generally do not enjoy broad scientific support. Perhaps the most sensible speculative stance is hybrid. The rifle's reputation results from an interplay of recorded trauma, environmental effects, psychological susceptibility, and social narrative. In such a model, small physical phenomena, mold spores causing headaches, conductive residues affecting a camera, combine with human expectations and communal reinforcement. Over time, these small interactions amplify into a full-fledged legend. The hybrid model honors parsimony while leaving room for the peculiar. It requires careful testing to separate the measurable from the interpretive. Speculative theories are valuable not because they settle the question but because they shape the kinds of empirical inquiries one might pursue. If one suspects physical contamination, the testing regimen is obvious. If one entertains psychometry, the experiment must be different, perhaps involving blind touch tests with people unaware of an object's reputation. If one suspects temporal anomalies, the necessary methods would involve precise instrumentation and reproducible observations. In every case, the challenge is to move from narrative plausibility to experimental design. Human minds are not neutral recorders. We are storytellers, pattern makers, and moral interpreters. The rifle's legend is as much a psychological production as it is anything else. Understanding the cognitive processes at play helps explain how ordinary events become freighted with extraordinary meaning. What creates trauma that often reverberates across generations? Family dynamics, economic hardship, and the ways grief is rehearsed in stories all carry psychological freight. Objects like a rifle can become focal points for this transmission. They function as concrete anchors for narratives that help survivors and descendants translate diffuse anxieties into specific, shared images. When children grow up in a household where a relic is treated as sacred or dangerous, they internalize that object's symbolic valence. Their later experiences, dreams, and interpretations reflect that early coding. The nocebo effect, the production of negative outcomes from negative expectations, is well documented in clinical contexts. If someone believes strongly that a particular object will bring harm, stress-related physiological changes can follow: sleep disruption, headaches, increased susceptibility to illness. Suggestion operates socially as well as individually. When a community treats an object as tainted, ambiguous events are more likely to be read as confirmation. This pattern explains the clustering of small misfortunes that, taken together, form a compelling narrative for those inclined to believe. Our cognitive architecture favors cause and effect stories. Post hoc ergo propter hoc, the fallacy of assuming that because B followed A caused B, is one of the brain's favorite shortcuts. Survival often depended on quick heuristics, but the cost is a tendency to see agents where only randomness exists. In the rifle's case, this means that unrelated incidents, an illness, a financial setback, a broken appliance, can be woven into a single explanatory cloth, the curse. Once the cloth exists, it is applied generously. Memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive. Each recollection is a new construction, colored by present beliefs and narratives. As stories about the rifle circulate, people reinterpret their pasts in that light. Minor incidents once unremarked become evidence in retrospect. The process is not deceitful. It is how humans make meaning. But it does complicate efforts to use testimony as objective proof. Cursed object narratives serve social functions. They can deflect blame from individuals or institutions, they can provide moral lessons about greed or disrespect, and they can serve as cohesive stories that bind communities. The rifle story performs work. It externalizes loss and makes a private wound into a public narrative. In communities still shaped by memory of Antietam, the story can also act as a ritualized form of attention to the past, a way to ensure that the battle's human cost is neither forgotten nor anonymized. Psychological explanations are not eliminative. They do not negate that strange or painful things happen. Instead, they offer parsimonious ways to account for why narratives coalesce, and how real biological and social processes can amplify otherwise small effects. For those invested in the rifle's tale, psychological accounts can feel like an attempt to explain away the uncanny. For skeptics, they offer powerful tools for demystifying what at first glance looks supernatural. To place the rifle in the broader map of human stories is to see it in conversation with myths from many times and places. Cursed objects exist in cultures across the globe, jewels that bring misfortune, swords said to carry the spirits of their makers, relics that demand respect. The rifle, in this tradition, is a modern variant of an ancient narrative type. Consider the famous legend of a pharaoh's tomb purported to carry a curse, a narrative that became globally famous in the 20th century after excavations in Egypt. That story fused imperial anxiety, exoticism, and the human desire to find moral consequence in transgression. Those who disturb ancient places invite retribution. The Antietam rifle stories share structural similarities. Both narratives locate a moral geometry, an act taking a thing from a place of power or death, and a consequence, misfortune that follows. The moral logic is conservative, respect the dead, and dangers will be averted. Similarly, in Japanese folk belief, tsukumogami are household objects that, after long service, acquire spirit and agency. They act on human scales, sometimes mischievously, sometimes vengefully. The rifle resonates with this motif as an ordinary artifact transformed by age and proximity to human intensity into a being that matters. That parallel helps us see the rifle story as part of a universal human practice, the anthropomorphizing of things that outlast their makers. In the microlocal scale, the rifle's narrative interacts with Antietam's veteran culture and the ways that communities curate memory. Stories about haunted battlefields and haunted relics do not exist in a vacuum. They are woven into commemorations, into graveyard pilgrimages, and into family stories told at holiday tables. These local stories are resistant to external correction because they function as identity keepers. They maintain a sense of place and continuity. The rifle thus becomes an artifact of placemaking as much as it is a subject of inquiry. Cursed object tales often perform pedagogical functions. They can warn against hubris, remind people to treat the past with humility, or critique the commercialization of trauma, for instance, when relics are bought and sold for profit. The rifle story contains these threads: the moral admonition not to treat objects of death as commodities, the ethical discomfort with profiting from violence, the social pressure to remember rather than to exploit. In that sense, legends of cursed weapons are a form of social conscience packaged as narrative. Communities also develop rituals to manage feared objects, retiring them to museums, conducting blessings or exorcisms, or simply refusing to speak of them. Such practices reflect a social need to contain uncertainty. When a family agrees to institutionalize the rifle, donate it to a museum, bury it, or lock it away, they are performing a ritual of closure. These acts do not prove or disprove the rifle's alleged influence. They show how communities adapt to objects that resist easy categorization. We began with a simple, haunting question: could a single artifact, a rifle said to have come from the fields of Antietam, carry echoes of the past into present lives? Over the course of our examination, we traced 4 broad avenues of inquiry and found each to illuminate parts of the story while leaving other parts stubbornly dark. First, the historical record. The Battle of Antietam took place on September 17, 1862, and remains the single bloodiest day in American military history, with roughly 23,000 men killed, wounded, or missing during 12 hours of fighting. The battlefield is a fixed place in national memory, with striking landmarks: Burnside's bridge among them, that still shape how the battle is recalled and how artifacts from the field circulate. These are not just rhetorical details. They are anchors that make plausible the presence of Civil War era infantry weapons in private and institutional collections today. Second, the archaeological and material perspective. The kinds of rifles commonly associated with the Civil War, Model 1861 Springfield type rifled muskets and the British pattern 1853 Enfield among others, were mass-produced, moved with armies, and later recycled into civilian hands. Museum collections and controlled excavations provide the tools to test provenance and to read the scars of environment and use on an object. Methods like metallurgical assays, microscopy, and residue analysis can reveal whether a particular rifle was indeed fired extensively, whether it sat in damp conditions, or whether it carries residues consistent with battlefield use. Where those tests are feasible and carried out with proper documentation, they drastically reduce the space for speculation about origin. Third, the scientific and environmental explanations. Many phenomena attributed to haunted objects can be explained by ordinary material and biological processes. Corrosion, lead residues, mold and mycotoxins, and the mechanical failure of old electronics are all plausible, testable mechanisms for headaches, strange smells, or battery drain. At the same time, physicists note that a wooden and steel rifle cannot, by itself, generate electromagnetic fields capable of disabling electronics. When such anomalies are reported, investigators must look for alternative sources, wiring, cameras, environmental equipment, before alleging anything more exotic. Good forensic work closes many mundane gaps, but it does not render subjective, emotionally laden experiences irrelevant. Fourth, psychological, social, and folkloric dynamics. Human cognition is a pattern-seeking machine. Confirmation bias, the nocebo effect, reconstructive memory, and social contagion all explain how ordinary sequences of misfortune can be woven into coherent legends. At the same time, cultural practices shape how communities treat relics from violent histories. Objects become mnemonic devices, vessels of mourning, and sometimes moral parables. The rifle's reputation, therefore, is as much a social artifact as it is a material one. It circulates in conversations, auctions, family stories, and museum cases, and in doing so it acquires social power. The ways communities manage fear, ritual retirement of objects, burial in museums, or quiet avoidance, are themselves data points we must respect and analyze. If the rifle were only an object of iron and wood, the story would be shorter. But it is not only material, it is memory, emotion, and human attention folded into physical form. That is the crucial, unsettling fact. Objects participate in human lives not merely by being used, but by being remembered. The rifle functions as a mirror in which families, collectors, and communities see themselves reflected back, their griefs, their questions about ownership of the past, and their anxieties about what it means to hold history in the palm of a hand. Consider what the rifle reveals about how we treat relics of violence. When we recover items from battlefields, we do more than collect curiosities, we collect responsibilities. Who can claim moral authority over an object tied to death? Is the ethical response to shield the object from commerce and make it a treasury of remembrance, or to study it scientifically and subject it to tests that risk desecration? The tension between stewardship and research is a live one, and the rifle's legend sits smack in the middle of it. There is also a practical lesson. Where people report physical symptoms or repeated misfortune linked to an object, the first response should be careful, non-sensational investigation. Test for toxins and fungi. Examine storage conditions. Document incidents systematically. Resist the easy narrative that wants a ghost at the center, because such narratives, while emotionally satisfying, can obscure remediable hazards or prevent families from taking steps that would reduce risk. At the same time, investigators should not reduce every human story to a lab result. People's experiences matter even when the causes are psychosocial. Treating those experiences respectfully, without condescension or excessive skepticism, builds trust and yields better evidence. Open-ended reflection also means tolerating ambiguity. Some phenomena will shrink under the light of instrumentation, Some will dissolve into patterns of memory and expectation. Others will remain odd, stubborn, and resistant. That persistence does not automatically license supernatural explanations, but it does demand humility. We should avoid the arrogance of claiming final knowledge where our instruments and theories have not yet provided it. Finally, consider the moral contour of obsession with cursed things. Sometimes the urge to possess, financial, mnemonic, or sensational, drives people to treat relics of suffering like trophies. The curse narrative, in some cases, functions as a corrective, a way to insist that artifacts of human violence carry consequences and must be treated with care. Whether or not the rifle exerts any literal influence, its reputation enacts a cultural warning: do not trivialize the past. Which brings us to the end of this leg of the inquiry and to the essential question that the story refuses to answer cleanly: what does it mean to inherit the past? Is the curse of the rifle a metaphysical force we do not yet understand, a cluster of material and environmental hazards, a social narrative that binds communities together, or some complex mixture of all three? Perhaps the most useful way to leave the matter is with a question rather than a verdict. Imagine standing at Burnside's bridge at dusk, the stones warm from the day, the creek moving in slow certainty below. The air tastes of moss and old rain. In your hands is a worn rifle, its wood smoothed by years of fingers. You can do three things: place it in a museum and let professionals study and steward it, bury it in the private silence of a family chest, or keep it in your home as a reminder, an heirloom whose meaning will unfold in the lives of those who hold it. Which choice honors the dead, protects the living, and preserves truth? Some will answer with scientific caution: test the object, document its chain of custody, and let the evidence guide action. Others will answer with ritual sensitivity: perform a blessing, a burial, or a formal retirement so that the past is respected rather than commodified. Still others will answer with narrative creativity: write the object into the community story in a way that refuses exploitation while acknowledging the power of memory. There is no single morally obvious choice. The absence of an easy answer is not a failure of detective work. It is a moral and epistemic fact about how human societies relate to their violent histories. The rifle is a condensed locus where history's hard facts, the date, the casualties, the recorded geography of a famous bridge, meet the messy business of memory and meaning. The facts about Antietam are clear and well documented. The battle occurred on September 17, 1862, producing thousands of casualties and leaving landmarks like Burnside's Bridge as living memorials. If you take nothing else away from this exploration, take this: the past is not inert. Whether through chemical residues, through the habits of memory, or through stories passed at kitchen tables, history keeps acting on the present. Treat the artifacts it leaves us with both the rigor of science and the sensitivity of ritual. In that middle ground we might find not answers that cleanly resolve every claim, but responsible ways to live with the traces of what has happened.